What makes an action morally good or morally bad? We first were introduced to this question when we read something from Abelard early on in the course. There we also learned that not only do philosophers disagree about how to answer this question, they disagree on what the question is really asking. So there are different ways of dividing up an action into its parts. Back when we discussed Abelard's approach to this issue, I said that usually in contemporary debates about how to assess actions, whether they're morally good or morally bad, we can distinguish between the state or disposition of an agent when he or she acts, and the intention that the individual has. There's the particular physical action that the person performs, and then there are the consequences of that action. And different moral theories will emphasize different aspects of an action in assessing whether what was done was morally good or morally bad. Abelard divided the moral act into roughly three parts. He talked about moral vices. He talked about the intention or consent, and he talked about the deed itself. He also talked a little bit about the consequences, but mostly he was interested in sort of the mental vices or the moral vices, the disposition of agents to act in a particular way, the internal consent or intention that the individual forms, and the actual performing of the deed. We saw that Abelard thinks that neither the mental vice or the moral vice, the disposition to act in a certain way, nor actually performing the deed itself are morally relevant. He thinks they're completely morally irrelevant. He thinks that the only thing that you need to look at in assessing whether a person has done something morally right or morally wrong is to look at what they consented to, what they intended. It's all on the inside. It's all on the will. When we look at what Aquinas says about this issue, we notice that he divides a moral action in two different ways. The first way in which he divides a moral act shows up in question 18. Here he divides the moral act into roughly three parts, though maybe there are two other less important parts that he discusses. And here I'm looking at the handout or the notes that I gave you on this topic. To get the most out of these lectures, you want to be following along in the notes, because for most of it I'll just be talking through them. So on the notes it says that St. Thomas divided the moral act into three main parts: the object, the circumstances, and the end. The object of the act is a description of what sort of act it is that you are performing. So for example, someone asks, well, what were you doing? You might say, well, the way to properly describe what I was doing is I was taking what belongs to someone else. The second part are the circumstances. These are like the accidents in a way. These are the particular time and place and degree in which the action is done. Something can be good in its object but bad in its circumstances, right? It can be good to eat a sandwich, but it can be bad to eat a sandwich at church. So what you've got is goodness in the object but not goodness in the circumstances, wrong place and the wrong time. The third part is the end, that for the sake of which the action is done. So for example, what was the end that you were intending? Well, I was doing this for the sake of giving alms, right? Or I was doing this in order to impress friends or something like that. These are the three main parts of the act then. The object of the act, what sort of act it is, the circumstances, when it is done, where it is done, and how it is done, and the end, that for the sake of which the action is done. Aquinas also mentions two other parts of the act. At one point he talks about the genus of the act. So the object gives us the species, but he also talks about the genus of the act. Here all he means, right, is the genus is what sort of thing it is. It's an act. It's something done. as opposed to the other genus, right? And that would be something like, instead of an action, it would be something like a quality or a relation. This is an action. This is the genus in which it belongs. That's how you can sort of categorize it that way. The other thing he talks about briefly are the consequences, and he does have some things to say about the role of consequences in determining whether someone has done something morally bad or morally good. But the three main ones he discusses are the object, the circumstances, and the end. Now, it seems pretty clear that an action can be good in one or more of these respects without being good in all of the different ways. As I said, you can be doing the generally right sort of thing, eating a sandwich, but in the wrong time and place in church. So you have failed to recognize or observe the proper circumstances. So good in its object, bad in its circumstances. Or something can be good in its object but bad in its end, right? So let's say that I am helping the old lady across the street. Good sort of thing to do. But maybe the end, right, is that I'm helping the old lady across the street because my pickpocket friend is on the other side. He's going to steal her wallet. So the end for which, right, I'm doing it in order to get the old lady's money is bad. And so even though the object, right, the sort of thing that I'm doing, helping the old lady across the street, is good, the end is not. So you can see that actions can break down in various ways. But when they do break down, what's the most important part in assessing whether the action performed was good or bad? Importantly, Aquinas says that all of these parts of the action have to be good in order for the action to be morally good. If any part is not good, then the action is morally bad. As he says in question 18, article 4. Nothing hinders an action that is good in one of the ways mentioned above from lacking goodness in another way. And thus it may happen that an action which is good in its species or in its circumstances is ordained to an evil end, or vice versa. However, an action is not good simply unless it is good in all of those ways, since evil results from any single defect, but good from the complete cause, as Dionysius says. So what he's emphasizing here is that you haven't done something morally good unless you've observed the proper object, the circumstances, and the end. If any of these parts is bad or inordinate, then the whole action is inordinate or bad. The second way in which Aquinas divides up an act in order to assess what's really important in determining whether someone has done something morally wrong or morally right is he separates in question 20 between the interior act of the will and the external action. The interior act of the will is just the intended end. Sometimes he calls this the interior object. It is the end that you intend from the inside. It is where sort of your will is at. The external action, or the external act, is what you actually do, the physical act performed, or perhaps the exterior object, but also the circumstances in which that act is performed. So you have sort of the internal part of it, which is your intention, your intended end, what you're trying to do. And you have the external act, what you actually did, and the circumstances in which you actually did it. And so this is a second way of dividing up the moral act, but it seems to line up roughly with the earlier distinction between object, circumstances, and end. End is in the will. The object can often be in the external act, and the circumstances are in the external act as well. So we might ask at this point, do both parts, that is, the interior act of the will and the external act, need to be good in order for the action to be morally good? Now, given that we have lined up this distinction with the earlier distinction, it seems like the answer ought to be yes, given that he thinks all three parts have to be good, and some of them are in the interior act of the will, and some of them are in the exterior act. It seems like both parts need to be good in order for the action to be morally good. And he seems to say that. But his approach to this gets a little bit complicated later on, as I want to talk about briefly. So if you look at Article 2, for example, here's what he says. He says, this is Article 2 of question 20. He says, we may consider a twofold goodness or malice in the external action, one in respect of due matter and circumstances, the other in respect of the order to the end. Now here, once again, in respect of due matter and circumstances, the due matter is the object. In other words, it's the right sort of action, and the circumstances, of course, but also of the order to the end. And we know that the order of the end has more to do with the interior act of the will. And that which is in respect of the order of to the end depends entirely on the will, while that which is in respect of due matter or circumstances depends on the reason. And on this goodness depends the goodness of the will, insofar as the will tends toward it. Now it must be observed, as was noted above, that for a thing to be evil, one single defect suffices, whereas for it to be good simply, it is not enough for it to be good in one point only, it must be good in every respect. If therefore the will be good, both from its proper object and from its end, it follows that the external action is good. But if the will be good from its intention and the end, this is not enough to make the external action good. And if the will be evil, either by reason or of its intention of the end, or by reason of the act willed, it follows that the external action is evil. So what he's emphasizing here is that you need both aspects in order to have a truly morally good act. It's not just about where your will is, but also about what you actually do and the circumstances in which you actually do it. So it looks like his answer is, do both parts need to be good in order for the act to be morally good? Yes, they do, based on his earlier account that you need all of the parts to be good in order for it to be morally good. But here's another interesting passage where he seems to say, well, maybe not as much, right? Maybe they do have to be both good, but maybe there's a sense in which, right, one of the aspects is more important than the other. And what he seems to settle on is that the interior act of the will is more important in assessing the morality of a person's action than the external act. So if we look at this, I've included this long quotation from Article 4. I think it's worth reading in full because this is where we get some further complications, but also sort of his final answer to this question. Here's what he says. If we speak of the goodness which its external action derives from the will tending to the end, then the external action adds nothing to this goodness, unless it happens that the will in itself is made better in good things, or worse, in evil things. This seemingly may happen in three ways. First, in point of number. If, for instance, a man wishes to do something with a good or an evil end in view and does not do it then, but afterwards wills and does it, the act of his will is doubled and a double good, or a double evil is the result. Secondly, in point of extension. When, for instance, a man wishes to do something for a good or an evil end and is hindered by some obstacle, whereas another man perseveres in the movement of the will until he accomplish it in deed, it is evident that the will of the latter is more lasting in good or evil, and in this respect is better or worse. Thirdly, in point of intensity, for these are certain external actions which, in so far as they are pleasurable or painful, are such as naturally to make the will more intense or more remiss. And it is evident that the more intensely the will tends to good or evil, the better or worse it is. So what he's just run through there in that paragraph is he identifies maybe three ways in which the external act can contribute to the moral goodness or moral badness of the will. So there is some role, there is some addition that the external act can make to the goodness or badness of what you've decided, what your intention is. But I want to move on to the next paragraph, which I think is an interesting one. Here's what he says. On the other hand, if we speak of the goodness which the external action derives from its matter and due circumstances, thus it stands in relation to the will as its term and end. And in this way it adds to the goodness or malice of the will, because every inclination or movement is perfected by attaining its end or reaching its term. Wherefore the will is not perfect unless it be such that, given the opportunity, it realizes the operation. But if this prove impossible, as long as the will is perfect, so as to realize the operation if it could, the lack of perfection derived from the external action is simply involuntary. Now, just as the involuntary deserves neither punishment nor reward in the accomplishment of good or evil deeds, so neither does it lessen reward or punishment if a man through simple involuntariness fail to do good or evil. So what he seems to be saying here is that yes, the external act can contribute to the goodness or badness of the action overall. But let's say that you form a good intention to do something good and for the right reason, but as it turns out, you are prevented from actually achieving this action by something that you could not reasonably overcome or you could not reasonably avoid. So, for example, right, this is something like similar to the examples that Abelard introduces. This isn't exactly Abelard's example, but here's an example, right? You have decided, right, that you're going to give alms, that you're going to donate to a particular charity, and on your way to donate to that charity, you are struck by lightning and die. So on the one hand, right, you have formed the right intention, you have intended to give to charity, but you were prevented from actually performing the deed by being struck by lightning. Now, does that mean that something is lacking in the moral goodness of your action? Aquinas thinks, in a way, yes, there's something about uh, it actually being completed that does make the situation morally better. But in terms of like what you are blameworthy for or what you can be praised for, he thinks that this will be largely the same because you were only prevented from performing the actual action by things out of your control. It works with bad actions as well, right? You can be um, on your way to commit an act of theft and struck by lightning there. It's like, yes, because you didn't actually perform the act of theft, there's something less bad about the situation, but you're still blameworthy, he thinks, right? Maybe in the fullest sense, because the only reason that you didn't perform the act of theft is because you were prevented by things outside of your control. Now, this is an interesting sort of question, and I don't actually know how to settle it myself. Because on the one hand, it seems like you ought to be only held accountable for things that are within your control. And sometimes whether the deed actually is accomplished is outside of your control. So it seems like maybe not always, in a lot of circumstances, you ought not be held accountable for failing to actually accomplish the deed. We don't think that anything is, let's say, morally worse about right what you've decided to do if you actually are able to perform the action. But I'm also less sure about that in some other cases. So, for example, it is true that we punish more harshly actual murders. We punish them more harshly than attempted murders. Or we imagine a sort of situation where, right, let's say I've had a little too much to drink and I'm driving home and I swerve and drive over the curb. And in this particular circumstance, there's nobody walking on the curb. But imagine that there was. Imagine that there were someone or some people walking on the curb when I swerve over and I hit them and I seriously injure them or even kill them. Now, in the one case in which there's no one there, right, maybe I've done something morally bad, but I probably won't get punished for that. I can get punished for, right, driving when I've had a little too much to drink, for sure. But it doesn't look like that I am punished or accountable for nearly as much as I am in the second case. And yet it seems like I've done the same sort of thing on the inside. And so it looks like we do punish more severely for those actions that you perform that, right? And to some extent, it might have been out of your control. We seem to do this already. It's sort of built into law. So I don't know. I'll go back and forth on this. But one of the questions I'm hoping that you guys consider, I know that several of you are writing on this topic for your final papers. I'm going to open up a discussion topic because I'm really interested in this interplay between Aquinas and Abelard. So when we first introduced Abelard, the idea that he said everything was in the intention or the consent, it seemed like a radical sort of view, and a lot of you voiced resistance in our discussion about that point in class. But now that we've looked through Aquinas, it looks like Aquinas, in some ways, seems to agree with Abelard here. He does think that whether the external act is actually performed can often be outside of your control, and you, can still assess whether what you did is morally bad or morally good, independent of the external act. Even though Aquinas is dividing up the action slightly differently than Abelard did and using different terms to refer to these parts, I think it's a real interesting question about whether Aquinas is really all that different or opposed to Abelard on this point. I've included an extra reading for you to read, two secondary sources on this topic, on whether Aquinas and Abelard are really all that different, about whether they really disagree on whether the intention or the consent is the most important part, and indeed maybe everything else is in some sense irrelevant. So go through that extra reading if you're interested, and I'll open up the discussion topic because I know some of you have some thoughts on this. As you read through, maybe rereading Abelard and reading through Aquinas on moral goodness of actions, how far apart are they really? I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Thanks very much.